Hi, I'm Jennifer Campbell, creator and host of the Systemic Leadership Summit. Welcome to today's session. And in this session, we'll be discussing how leaders can create organizational systems so they can be deliberately adaptive and self-transforming and operate at their disruptive edge by means of a systemic approach. My guest for today will be discussing the importance of understanding co-creation and circularity, detangle organizational culture myths, and the value of her methodology called Orgonomics. And her name is Joan Lurie. Joan is a pioneer in the area of systemic change, organizational strategy, and leadership development. She's the creator of Orgonomics, a proprietary systemic methodology designed to help top-tier leaders fundamentally transform their businesses and thrive in the emerging economy. Joan holds 2 master's degrees, one in developmental psychology from Columbia University in New York, where she was a Fulbright scholar, and a second in adult education and development from Wits University in South Africa. Joan works as a CEO at the CEO level to help leaders design and lead complex, adaptive, and disruptive change in their business models, culture, and organizational systems. With over 20 years of practice and experience working in and consulting to businesses with turnaround results. Applying the Orgonomics methodology, Joan has worked with leading organizations, including ANZ, Carlton United Breweries, Dulux Group, Incitec Pivot Limited, whole mouthful, Allens and Sydney University, amongst others. Referred to as groundbreaking, Orgonomics allows leaders to rewire their thinking to be more systemic, reframe roles and perspectives, and repattern their organizations for new ways of operating to achieve higher order functioning and performance. Joan's purpose is helping leaders and organizations continue to develop, grow, and be successful. In her own words, learning to think systemically, to see the systems we're in, and reframe the roles we play in those systems is becoming more and more critical as we learn to adapt ourselves and our organizations to be fit for the age of complexity. And today she's here with us in the Systemic Leadership Summit. A very warm welcome to you, Joan. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you for having me, Jennifer.
Yes, and so let's start our conversation then. And I'm really excited to talk to you about various different topics related to myths around culture and complexity. But first, I want to start off with you and your purpose. And as I mentioned in your intro, what it is, I would like to know, how did your purpose, which is so tied to the systemic, find you?
Yeah, I had recently returned from doing my Fulbright scholarship in New York, where I'd done my master's in adult development and, in developmental psych with a focus on adult development. And before I left, I was working for a company where the CEO of the company was really a very visionary man and was at the end, sort of the end of the apartheid era. The apartheid was sort of, unraveling finally, and he had brought a group of us in to transform the culture of the company, break down racism, prepare it for post-apartheid South Africa. And he had really seen his role as the CEO as not just delivering shareholder value, but actually making a contribution to a peaceful transition in South Africa. And so I had been working in this company, and we had been doing deep culture change work. And then I'd got this opportunity to go off to New York. And when I came back, we were continuing with the culture change work, but he also realized he needed to change the operating model of the business. There were 3 different independent businesses in the group, and they were mostly starting to compete against each other and becoming less and less profitable. And so he wanted to merge these three companies into one.
Yeah.
And in order to do that, he brought out a consultant to work with us who had been experimenting and developed a systemic methodology that he had heard about that was getting quite remarkable results in helping build coherence in systems and help make fundamental change in organizations. And I had just come back to Johannesburg, and this work was just kicking off. And the consultant, Irving Borwick, who he had brought out, had developed this idea of starting to work more systemically in organizations. His wife, Bella, was a family therapist, and he had seen the remarkable results they were getting through using systemic principles in family contexts.
Yeah.
And so off I went to this program in the Kruger National Park to kick off this transformation in the company. And on day one, he said to us, I'm going to give you a new pair of glasses. I'm going to change the way you see the world. And that was a gift to me, because that pair of glasses was a systemic pair of glasses. And what it showed me was that it was a completely different way to see the world. And as that putting on those glasses, it's almost quite magical, because you start to see things you never saw before. And as a result of using this systemic approach, we were able to changed the company quite rapidly. Within 9 months, we'd merged the three businesses, increased profitability by 70%, but people were starting to think and operate in quite different ways in relation to each other. And so that magical gift that I got in 1993, that became my new sense-making, my new meaning-making. And so it framed everything I did professionally. And I really love what Fritjof Capra says, is that all of our problems in the world really stem from that we don't have systemic meaning making and that form of mind, and we need a metanoic shift of mind, I think he calls it. And so that has become my deep purpose, is really how to help grow this form of mind, how to shift and help people move from mechanistic to more systemic understanding of the world, but particularly if in organizations, and then how we can use organizations to grow this form of mind and systemic change that organizations are needing to do, like we did in that context, to start to rewire how we help leaders see the world.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. And it must have been because it's the early 90s that you're talking about, when when you had the opportunity to work on such a project that at least in my mind, when I hear from other leaders or systems practitioners or anyone else, is that the early 90s are, it wasn't mainstream yet, and it's still not mainstream. The systemic field is an emerging field, a growing field, rapidly growing field. But I so strongly resonate with what you said, is that you were given a pair of glasses, systemic glasses, and once you look through them, it's almost like there's no going back. I spoke to Fritjof Capra also within the context of this summit, where he indeed spoke about that the complex problems that we have in the world require that we put on these glasses, these systemic glasses, because they're very complex, and solutions to them are also complex. And if we don't approach them that way, then that's going to make things very difficult for us to move forward. So thanks so much for sharing this in your intro of our conversation. And we're going to detangle this a little bit and talk about your experience of helping leaders design and lead complex and adaptive and disruptive change in their organizational context, or maybe even in a bigger context. And so let me ask you, when you start working with them in a change situation, and ever since that moment that you described earlier, they of course themselves have a way of looking at their organization. And in many cases, they will probably not have those systemic glasses on. And so they look at the change and they look at their organization, and also look at their organizational culture, which is something that I know that you recently published an article. It was in the Australian Financial Review about myths around corporate culture. And as culture is such a determining factor for leaders and how they look at their organization, could you share with us what is wrong or not working with our current understanding of corporate culture and our assumptions around that concept?
Yeah. So I think there are a couple of, dominant assumptions that have become implicit in the field of corporate culture, both in sort of by consultants and practitioners, but also in leaders' minds and in the sense making in organizations.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those dominant assumptions, I think, have become so sort of our fast thinking and implicit that we're not stepping back from them and really saying, are they actually still valid? Are they relevant? And what are we missing? Because we keep seeing that corporate culture and change programs don't reveal the return on investment that they're looking for, that only 20 or 30% of them are successful. And yet we still keep coming at them with the same assumptions and with the same programs. And we're not stepping back and saying, what is it that we need to change in our thinking that really will shift our success and our ability to really bring about change in culture, in organizations? So, we've just had the Royal Commission into banking in Australia, and, one of the things that was strongly recommended is that every bank or financial services institution has to change their culture. And there was a flurry of commentary after that, and of course heaps of recommendations around how banks and leaders should fix their culture.
Yeah.
And I think, even that is, as a starting point, problematic. I don't think you fix culture. And I think that even that language that, culture is something that you can fix rather than like it's some technical thing that you can switch on and off. And therefore some simple programs that you can roll out, which is sort of flowing from that inherent assumption. If you just change the performance and reward system, then you'll change behavior. These really simplistic notions around how to fix in very linear ways. And I think fundamentally behind that is there isn't an assumption that culture is a complex adaptive problem, and that actually you've got to come at it through that lens and not roll out simple programs that you do to the system and assume that in some linear way, if you roll out those programs, you'll get, the kind of behavior that you're expecting. So I think at the very start, we've got to really look at the big holding kind of mythology that sits around, and then culture, and then everything that kind of hangs off that. So you'll see typically that organizations will talk about, one of the myths is that, we need to change the values. And so there's often a whole lot of activity around changing our corporate values and really spending time crafting and recrafting those, as if you were to just draw up a new set of values in some miraculous way, you'll change culture.
Yeah. And I do want to say before we move on to the next one about this first one in the context of what makes up the myths around corporate culture is that the underpinning of this myth is also we change one aspect, which is the values, and then that is going to change everything, just like the performance and appraisal system that we change, that will change all the behavior. So an underpinning from the values is then a linear sort of approach, isn't it?
Yeah. So all those sort of approaches hang off that big dominant assumption that you can roll out something to the system, and to the system, like change the values or change. And these are sort of technical levers that you can pull that are going to, in some linear causal way, get the behavior change that you're looking for.
Yeah.
And I think what it misses is that the system the organization in itself is a system that has got into a complex set of interrelatedness, and that unless you put on the glasses and start to make those patterns in the organization of relatedness between the parts and how everyone's taking up their role, or how people are actually framing their roles and therefore taking them up, and that complex set of relatedness in roles and the assumptions people are holding actually drive behavior as much as the values that individuals hold, or that values that you might roll out in a corporate booklet, or having beautiful form on the wall when you walk into or reception areas. And I think that's the blind spot when it comes to culture. I don't hear the mainstream talking about what are the deeply embedded assumptions, collective or individual, that people are holding in this organization. What are the roles that people feel compelled to take up, or that the system is requiring of people to take up, either explicitly or implicitly, and where are those patterns of relating that the system has just got into, that have become so implicit that they're not even visible. And how do we start to make that visible in order to start to shift culture and really change the system, rather than change the system by putting stuff into it but actually not changing the structure of it. And I think that's the big shift that we want to try, and I'm certainly hoping that we'll be able to bring a more systemic lens to culture and culture change in that way.
It's what clicks for me when you say this is that in many also management models and ways of looking at your organization, is that culture is usually mentioned as one of the different aspects within an organization that you can look at from the outside, just like, for example, structure and strategy are, and that they are like buttons you can press, or things you can switch and turn or tweak or fix, so that you can increase the performance of the whole. Whereas actually there are layers underneath culture and underneath everything else that that really help us to look more at the foundational interrelatedness that's present within our organizations, and that we are also part of as leaders, because doing something to the system implies that you're not part of it.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that's one of the fundamental myths that I talk about, is that that leaders talk about how they are going to change the culture as if they are not the culture. And the program has to be rolled out to all staff, but actually they should be stepping back and looking at their role in the system and seeing themselves as an integral part of the system, and questioning what role have we played that has contributed to this, not with bad intent, but how is it that we've taken up our role? What role have we played? How might we shift our role in the system and not see themselves as, separate from it? And one of the things that I do with leaders when I start to work with them is I ask them to start drawing the map of the system, the organizational system as they see it. And very often they leave themselves out. Exactly what you're talking about, and it's really fascinating. And then I say, I notice you haven't put yourself in, and that just that moment of realization that the system is not something outside of you. You are an integral part of it, and you've got to be able to see how you connect in with it and the role that you're playing in it. And I think if leaders were starting to do that, we would have a much greater chance of, helping the system create a new way of being. And that they need to be part of that solutioning or emerging. So I really agree with you.
And so we were talking about the myths around corporate culture, and the moving away from the linear and the separateness into the systemic and the underpinning values and or the underpinning assumptions that that sort of drive the way we look at our organizations and the role of leadership in it. Are there any other myths you would like to share before we move on to that transition that you help leaders make?
Yeah, I think one which is really important is, and I think worth mentioning, is that often what I see is that leaders tend to give over the responsibility or the accountability for changing culture to human resources divisions of the company, to people and culture. They even, a lot of in Australia, a lot of the HR divisions are now called people and culture. And, I think some of the problem with that is that then it's almost assumed that it's their problem to solve, and that the ownership of culture change sits with them. And whilst I think that HR divisions and corporate people and culture teams have an absolutely critical role to play, I don't think that leaders should be giving over to them, that it is their accountability. Culture change has to be leader-led. It has to be, like the CEO in South Africa who began that culture change program that was so successful. He saw it as a critical part of his role, and it was his accountability and his executive team's accountability. And HR were a critical enabler of that, and to bring the tools, to bring, to hold leaders to account and to help create infrastructure and scaffold for the change, but not that the change was theirs. And I think we do need to bring about a repatterning of that if we're going to be successful with corporate culture. I think what I'm talking about is that the change management system that sits around and in relation to corporate culture needs to be really reframed. And, because I think sometimes it's sort of given over to HR, and HR's role is not seen for what it should be. And then I think at other times actually additional structures get created, like, culture change committees. And, in many ways, leaders in all of those structural moves are actually giving up some of their role and accountability for the change. I think that culture change has got to be led by executive teams and boards, and in how they take up their role to run the organization, not handed over to additional structures or other areas of the business. And I think we have to re-look at the change management systems, the change systems that sit around corporate culture is one of the critical myths that need to be reset.
I couldn't agree with you more, specifically because I've been in the change field for my entire career, which and I find it striking, this giving up of the part of the leadership role when it comes down to change. And so I really love the word that you use of repatterning, of creating new and different patterns around how we guide the change process of our organizations as systems, and that it's something that cannot be done without the leadership, and that the leadership role in it is crucial, and that that cannot be outsourced. So I think that part of the repatterning has to do with the insourcing, with the taking back of the responsibility, with like having a new sense of role clarity around what leadership actually does in that. And that's sort of when I get back to how do you guide leaders in that transition? Because the myths you described are so rooted into some core principles about how do we build and grow our organizational systems, and what are the roles and functions in that to create an organization that that can live longer, that can deal with all kinds of velocities in terms of growth and change and disruption and everything else. And at the same time be adaptable to all those influences as well. So how do you help them make that transition?
I think one of the things that Irving Borwick introduced to us when he offered us the pair of glasses was a new frame for understanding how you can shift behavior in organizations, a systemic frame for that. And what is really core, and what I have then spent the last 25 years building on, is this idea that if you want to bring about change, you can help people see the role that they're playing in the system and reframe that role. And in fact, that role drives behavior as much as who we are, our character, our personality, our values. And I think one of the things that organizational development theory and practice and leadership theory and practice until now is absolutely steeped in an interpersonal and a psychological frame of the world, that, you know, a lot of, if you want to bring about change in behavior, you've got to change the person. You know, there's something about their character or their style or their values that need to shift. And, you know, there's another frame which says actually you can leave all of that intact. You can stay core to who you are, but you can reframe the role that you see yourself playing, or you help others see themselves playing. And it's based on this idea that we all actually carry a mental map, a construct in our head of our role in the system, in the multiple systems we're in. And in fact, you know, if we think about it, you know, if I wake up in the morning, the first role I'm in is role of partner, and I'm in a marriage system, I behave in a particular way. If I go and start engaging with my children, you know, and I step into role of parent, my behavior changes instantly. Of course it does, because my role as parent would define what is acceptable behavior, and I would run a set of assumptions around what a good parent role looks like. And then, you know, my mother might be visiting from South Africa, and I will have to engage in a, you know, parent-child relationship and take up a different role, and of course my behavior would change again. And so if we think about it, we take up multiple roles through a day in multiple subsystems, and every time we step into a different role, we shift behavior. And that is appropriate, because the context and the system and the role will actually start be, you know, define what is okay behavior. And we would run assumptions about that, and, you know, not everyone runs the same set of assumptions about how to take up those roles. But if we can start to make visible for leaders and for ourselves the mental maps and constructs and assumptions we're running about what role we should be playing, and the assumptions about how we should be taking up that role, and how that role relates and connects with other roles, then we can start to help leaders see how they are part of a system, and how everything they're doing through the role they're taking up is contributing to the outcome or the result that that system is emerging at a point in time. And that a very powerful lever for them is to step back from that and see the role that they're playing, and the, you know, hold as object the mental map or construct that they're running that they don't even know they've got. It's like a filter or a lens. You know, when I start to ask leaders, well, just draw me a map of how you see the system and your role in it, everyone can do that. And then they'll go, oh, I didn't know I was even holding that map. I didn't know that I had that. And so it's even these maps that we hold of the system have become implicit to us. It's like a filter or a lens that we wear as we navigate the world. But we really start to need to, if we could start to peel back that lens and that filter and hold it out as object to us, then we would be able to start to see ourselves in system and how we live in our own reality and step back from that and therefore change it. And the beauty of this idea is that you actually don't have to change a lot of what's core to you. You don't have to give up what is authentically you, but you can give up and hold much more lightly a role or an assumption about role or something around how you see yourself connecting to other roles in a system.
Yeah.
So when I'm sort of using the example of repatterning the role of HR to leadership in the system, both have absolutely vital roles, but those roles at the moment are a little bit the wrong way round. And, we need to repattern how those roles relate and connect. And, making that visible is really important. But we could use, multiple examples of where using this as a key lever for change becomes incredibly liberating, almost magic.
Yeah, and so this is something fascinating the way you put it, because there's this realization, something that clicked for me is the importance of understanding that you do not equal your role. So you as a person take up roles in systems, and
Absolutely.
It's not like you and your personality and everything else equals the role that you fulfill. And so by zooming out and looking at what are the mental constructs that I have around my role and around the organizational context that I fulfill that role in, you can then also access the systemic lens much more and much better than when you stay in that bubble where the person and the role are collapsed. And it's also interesting what you mentioned about mental constructs, and that we have actually many of them, because we move on a day-to-day basis. We move around in so many different systems, like the examples that you gave about being a spouse or being a parent or being in your professional roles. There's so many different contexts that we fulfill roles in, and becoming aware that these are all mental constructs that we can look at and also change in order to better serve the context that we are part of, is an exercise that many a leader does not learn in business school.
That's right.
Because the mental models and the constructs are actually implicit in the business models and the leadership approaches that are taught there. And so it's actually no one's fault when they are in a leadership role and they just assume I can outsource certain things to HR or to other departments. Because there is a step in between that needs to be done, which is all about the mental constructs. And then when there's sort of this loosening up of the collapse of the personal and the role, it's also easier to then understand, oh, wait a minute, I'm part of different systems. I fulfill roles in the systems. How do I show up in those roles? And how, from the showing up, can I contribute then to what's actually needed in the system, rather than fueling a role from a, I don't know, maybe more ego driven type of perspective, or from self-interest, or it could be anything. So it's really interesting to see how you help leaders, is by first looking at what are our underlying assumptions, what are our mental models, what roles do we fulfill, and then once there's this loosening up, it's I assume so much easier to then introduce the systemic lens, is it not?
Yeah, it is. And I think that there is so much depth and complexity and richness in the field, in systems theory, and such a long history. And, if you really get into, it can get really difficult difficult to kind of make sense of, because there's so many different theories, and in so many different domains, from physics to ecology to family systems. And so trying to bring the idea of systems thinking into a form which is really accessible to leaders is what is deeply purposeful for me, because I think we have to meet leaders where they are, and we've got to make it make sense to them in the context in which they are. And mostly those are in their organizational context to start off with. And that's why I think teaching systems thinking and bringing this lens in the organizational context through this really sort of simple but deeply complex frame opens up a doorway. And it's something that they can really easily connect with and make sense with, and it's deeply practical and accessible, and then it opens up a whole new world. And I think it is a very helpful way in to systems for leaders to actually see just the simple, not so simple, but just to see not the simple, but the system that you are in, that you're a part of, and how you're constructing it. It is a very meaningful way in. And I remember myself doing my first system map with Irving in 1993, and just the power of drawing the map and realizing that I carried a map was, that realization was powerful. And then to see the map that I carried. So there was one layer of realization. What became object to me was, I could see was I carried a map. The second was I could see the map. I had drawn it. I could hold it out. And I was sort of like, with curiosity, I could look at that and say, oh, is that how I'm seeing the world? So another level became object to me. And then through the questioning that Irving took me through, I was able to see, I play a role in that system. And I was able to see where I was locating myself relative to others and other roles in that system. And, wondering whether that was the only role I could play and the only place to locate myself. So it opened up all kinds of possibility for me in my thinking, and how I could then go back into the system and change the role that I was playing and actually make quite a different contribution. And so it's just a very powerful tool, because it's layer upon layer of helping you to step back and be able to see through this lens in a very practical way. That's important at a moment in time.
And so thank you also for explaining this and bringing this back to your own realizations. And from my understanding is that these realizations and experiences and the unpacking of the impact of looking at your roles and your maps and putting on the systemic glasses, that sort of developed and turned into your own methodology, which is also about the systemic, called Orgonomics. And could you share more with us about how your journey that, let's say at the starting point of 93, how did that sort of develop into Orgonomics? So what is it, and how did that develop for you?
So how it developed was, once I kind of put on the glasses and started to see that actually organizations were complex set of interrelatedness, complex adaptive system, and started to apply this idea of change the role, not the person, look at the role relatedness and the patterns of relating between the parts, I was kind of hooked, and I just wanted to learn more and more about how do you help make systems visible, how do you help systems change these patterns, how do you help adults reframe these assumptions and mental maps they hold about role. And what was particularly intriguing to me was the idea that I had just done a master's in developmental psychology and looked at the work of Robert Keegan, who, you know, I don't know if you know Robert Keegan's subject-object theory or construct mental theory, but he talks about the subject-object move that adults are able to make, which shifts, you know, our meaning-making system in adulthood. And it was just struck me how powerful this was, that this was one way of helping adults hold more and more as object, but in a systemic frame, not just, you know, an interpersonal frame about self or as other sort of more general assumptions you would be able to hold as object. So I was deeply curious about how this would become and could become a methodology for growing adults into, you know, holding more and more as object and doing adult development work, and at the same time doing systemic work. And so this beautiful sort of fusion of being at the nexus of adult development and systemic change and development simultaneously. And, you know, that has driven my curiosity about how we join those two pieces together, and they are deeply joined and intertwined, but how we do that more deliberately. And so I went on after that first program with Irving Borwick to be trained and licensed by him in some of the methodology and products that he had developed. And so I learned more and more about systems theory, and I practiced more and more in that organization over and over again the application of some of the Borwick's products, and worked with him in Europe. He used to fly me to work in Europe, to Europe to work with some of his clients. And so it just became more and more an open neural pathway for me, the way I kind of saw the world, but also more and more of my practice. And so over the last 25 years, I have just experimented really with how to bring this practice in different ways to organizations and to leaders, and, you know, tried different things. And so through that experimentation, I've evolved many different ways of using it, either for individuals through coaching programs, starting with mapping and focusing on helping them look at the role they're playing in the system, and I call it coaching with the system in mind, so that they are able to see the system they hold in their mind and how their map is not necessarily the territory. And then also to make sense of the territory and the system they're in, so that they can step into it and help change it, because, you know, behavior is never of the system. So I work, I've sort of developed practices that help individuals in that way, but then also more systemic practices for the whole system, where I create space, help leaders create space for the system to be self-observing. And to basically step back and share their observations about what they're noticing about how the system's working, the patterns of interrelatedness in the system, and to identify where they want to shift those patterns and what their growth edges are, and build more and more coherence in the collective assumptions that sit inside the system. So I've developed methodology which helps them step back, you know, stand on the balcony, so to speak, and observe the roles they're each playing at a subsystem level, how those subsystems are interrelating, where the noise points are, where there are incoherence exists, and, you know, in how the one party is defining it versus the other, and then to build more and more alignment and coherence in the system so they can work more with flow. And often what I'm doing with that is we will create that context in real business challenges that they face. So where they know they have to make change, I give them this methodology to look at real business problems. And I think that's the key, because, you know, adults want to learn and grow in contexts where it is deeply important and meaningful to them. And so creating those real contextual learning opportunities where they've got real business or organizational challenges and they can practice this work in there, I've found is really helpful. So, you know, I have things called system learning labs where you step back from your business challenge and observe how you're working as a system. How is each part taking up their role, relating to another part? How is the whole system working to land you in this position, but also in kind of understanding how you need to tackle that particular business problem. And so much gets revealed, so much becomes visible to the system. And, you know, once you can hold something as object and you can help make it visible, then you can do something with it.
Yeah. And so thank you for taking us on your journey, because what you're actually saying is that from that initial invitation to look at your own role, look at your own maps and the systemic lens, you then went into, so how does this work for a person who picks up a role or roles in a system or in multiple systems, and how do I guide them in becoming more aware of the idea that the mental maps that they have are not necessarily what's out there, but that reflection process can help them to contribute more from their role, or in different ways from their role, or where they can pick up different roles, so that they can contribute. And then you also mentioned how you work with one or more multiple subsystems within the bigger system, where you do a similar sort of process, but then with the subsystem, so that they can not only look at their own roles, but also look at the interconnectedness and where there's matches and mismatches and noise and everything else. And then to see, okay, how are we contributing to the whole? And are we doing that from a place of the maps that we hold, and what do these look like, and how aware have we become, and what does that do with the choices we then make for how we want to move forward from here? So my understanding of what you explained from your methodology around orgonomics has very much to do with enhancing the systemic awareness levels in the people you work with, whether it's an individual or a collective, and that you do this in multiple ways, where you create almost like a reflective process that allows them to basically reframe and reconsider their contribution to the whole. So is that what orgonomics is?
Yeah, I think so. I think it is really shifting the fundamental assumptions for how we understand organization and bring about change in organization.
Yeah.
And it's a shift out of change the person and interpersonal work into actually constructivist view, reframe assumptions, reframe roles, shift role relatedness and patterns for, you know, how the different parts of the system are working together. And actually you can bring about change really rapidly. And, you know, the wonder of it is that actually as you start to do that practice and that work, as that system becomes visible to you and you start to do the reframing, things change quite quickly. And I have a few leaders who talk about it. You know, in the middle of one program I was doing with a CEO and his top 40 leaders, he came to me and he said, "This is like fairy dust, Joan." You know, it feels that quite magical, because stuff we've been stuck with for a really long time is suddenly just sort of unraveling itself, because we've got this new way of thinking about it. And instead of sort of making it personal and making it about the other, now it's about role relatedness. So it takes a whole lot of the resistance out of the system, and people will start to see that it's circular. It's not just the other that's wrong or got it wrong. It's in the relatedness of two different constructs and in the co-creation of that the problem resides. So, you know, it's less about now starting to fix other and correct other and give other people feedback around what they need to change, and actually seeing the whole and the pattern of relating, including self, and therefore being able to shift that. And that brings in, you know, a neutrality which allows people to come to change with much more ease. And also, not having to give up what is core to them, but you can hold role and assumption a lot more likely than you hold on to your identity or your values or what's core.
Yeah. And so in this example, with the CEO and his 40 leaders, what is it that we can do to invite leaders to step into this work? Or is there something like an innate type of curiosity or an inner stance that they need to have in place to be open to this type of work? Because not all leaders are, and some are very attached to the collapse of the personal interest and their role. So so what does it require for leaders to open up to the rewiring and the repatterning?
I think that's such a great question, and I think probably in different contexts it would be different. I think it's quite contextual. I think in some instances leaders have a problem that they're really stuck with, that they've been stuck with for a long time, and they've tried the linear, mechanistic, programmatic stuff, and it's just not working. And so they're almost at a point where, okay, give me something else, and I'm open to trying it. And I have one client that really was at that point. They were continually losing market share. They weren't being successful. They weren't meeting budget every month. And everything they tried, all the technical solutions they had tried, had not shifted the dial. So, they tried to put in CRM systems and training programs and I don't know how many organizational restructures, and, all the technical levers that leaders pull, in order to bring about change. And so he had heard about this work, and also his head of HR had heard about the work, the COO, and who was running the company. And he said, okay, we're going to do another restructure. And his head of HR said, no, we're not going to do another restructure because, we keep doing the restructure. It's actually not leading to the change. We have to try some different. It's the height of madness for us to continue to do that and not get the result. And so there was an openness for him at that point to say, well, I should be then trying something else. But there was also someone else in the system, the head of HR, who was able to hold the boundary and not be reactive and say, sure, I'm going to do another restructure. And she shifted her role and held a boundary and said, actually, we have to change something else, and therefore created enough openness to a different possibility through the role and how she took it up. So I think, that's one contextual way that it happens. I think in other ways, leaders are realizing that they are faced with more and more disruption now, more and more complexity, and that people have to shift role, with much more ease and adapt a lot quicker. And so they're looking for ways. There's an openness emerging, I think, systemically for looking for, well, how do we deal with this complexity? How do we deal with this disruption and adaptation? So I think there are cracks where the light is getting in and possibility which is opening up, which is allowing this work. I think I have a deep sense of the paradigm actually starting to shift. And I was talking to someone about it last night. I think more and more I hear people talking about system leadership and systemic change. I think what is, though, happening at the same time is that there isn't a lot of tools and methodology for leaders in organizations, which, even if they're ready to make the shift, then it's sort of like, so then what do I do? And there's not a lot to fall back on. So I'm finding that even if they're open to saying, I want to try something that's more systemic, and they're looking for the tools and the scaffold, and there's not much out there. And so what I see happening is they want to try systemic change, but they'll bring in old tools. Things like RACI and tools that are no longer fit for complexity.
This is something I so much recognize as you're sharing this, as you're saying this, and it so resonates also with the purpose of the context of this summit, obviously. Um, but what I hear you say is that there are more and more leaders and more organizations are open to different approaches, more systemic oriented approaches, because they're stuck in a pattern and they're rerunning it and it's not working, or
Yeah.
they realize we need to disrupt ourselves, we need to be agile, we need to deal with all the change that's happening in our organizational context if we want to still be here tomorrow and thrive tomorrow.
Yeah. I think, sorry, Jennifer, you asked me two other ways in, that help leaders open up to this. And I think stories and case studies are incredibly helpful. And often, what I'm finding is as this work is more and more successful, then, there's more and more referral and leaders are looking over and saying, oh, I want some of that. How did you do that? And so I think that using storytelling and really giving leaders examples and case studies of how it's practically applied is one very helpful way, and stories are very powerful. And I think the other is just to invite them into experimentation and to, step into it with a bit of like, I'm not sure where this is going to go, but, I'm open to the experimentation because I know I can't just roll out a solution. I don't know what the end state looks like. And I do think inviting them into having a play and to experimentation is sometimes a way that I find is a great invitation into the work.
Yeah. So storytelling and the experiment are also great ways to help them cross that edge, because it is an edge for them. It's unknown territory. It's a place where they are not in the traditional control role. So I can imagine.
And that is scary.
Yeah,
that
is very scary.
Because the role of leader has always been, until now, to have the answer, to set the vision, to take people on the journey. And now we're inviting leaders in complexity and adaptation to say, actually, you can't have all the answers. You can't stand at the beginning and control the outcome. And we're reframing what it means to be a leader in organizational systems now. And that role reframe is a big challenge for leaders, because it really is letting go their old map and construct for themselves, but also of what the system expects of them. People have always, it's co-created, so people have always expected that of leaders. Well, you should know the answers, so just tell us what the vision is. And if you're not doing that, then you're remiss as a leader. You changing your mind, you don't know what you're doing. And that's hard to, that sort of circularity around breaking that pattern actually is important work for us to do.
Is there a space where you would not use this approach, where you would not use the Orgonomics methodology, or not invite leaders? Is there any space or situation where you would not use it?
It's such a great question, and I'd have to think about it, but nothing emerges for me straight up. I can't immediately think of any context where it wouldn't be helpful. Or where you'd say, no, absolutely, you wouldn't use it. I mean, there might be contexts where you would use it with other approaches, but not one where you'd say it's purely another approach and this wouldn't be a helpful lens that you could bring, or that, where you'd leave it out completely.
So I asked that question in support of those who are in the mental model of, when do I use a methodology and when not? When do I ask a systems worker for help and when not? And and that's also okay, where we
Yeah.
find ourselves in a space of the unknown and the space of the experiment, as you mentioned it also, and we don't know exactly what's going to come out, which is also part of this whole approach. And
Yeah.
we've almost come to the end of our conversation. Time really flies when we're
Yeah.
when we're speaking about these things. And Joan, I'm just really curious because it started back in the beginning of the 90s for
Yeah.
you, and
I was.
and you've been working with that ever since. And and I just want to know how that impacted your life and the roles that you fulfill, and also you're also the CEO in your own company. So how did that influence your leadership and the role of leadership for you?
That's a great question. I mean, I think, as you say, Jennifer, once you wear the glasses, you see things and you can't unsee. And,
Mm-hmm.
once you have this deep awareness of always being of a system, whether it's a system of two in a marriage or a system of four, a family system, or then it is just becomes the implicit way I see the world. So I'm always thinking about the role that I'm taking up, how my role connects, what assumptions am I bringing, and so that just frames the way that I navigate the world, really.
Mm.
And I think, though, and it's been deeply helpful to me, on a very personal level, when I actually got back to South Africa in 1993. I lost my father to cancer, and my brother was bipolar, and my father was the primary caregiver in the family. And so what was so liberating for me about the discovery of the glasses and the methodology at that time was that it was amazing for my professional life and work, and it brought such a richness and a new way of thinking and practice. But actually it was deeply helpful for me and my family to make that transition at that time for how we were going to manage that in our family system. And I think if I hadn't got that gift then at that moment in time, my life would have been quite different, because I would not have been able to navigate that deep transition in my family life and help my family through that, in terms of how we all had to shift the role and accommodate the loss of my father, and the role that he had played in a complex family system. So it was a deep gift to me, both professionally and personally, and I think that's why I'm so deeply purposeful about it as well, because I find how helpful it was to me on so many levels, and the deep difference it can make. So both professionally and personally, it's quite a magical gift, and I'm deeply grateful for the gift I got then and want to pay it forward.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much for sharing this also very personal aspect of why you are why you hold the purpose that you hold, and that you live and work from that purpose. And one final question: if from all what we've talked about today, what is, if it's up to you, what is the essence of what we shared that you would like our viewers to take away?
I think the essence is that we are all always part of a system, and we're always in role, and that, as you say, the role is not who we are, but it is something that we can step in and out of, and how we define those roles and how we take them up and can be deeply powerful in influencing how the whole system operates. And if we are able to step back from our own sense making around how we're constructing and seeing ourselves in the system and how the system's working, and then shift how we're taking up the role, I think we would be, that would be the essence of it, because I think that is where the magic and the power lies, that we start to see ourselves as part of a deep interconnected universe, and you can never not be of it. As people, we are nature, we are the ecosystem, we are not man and nature or human and nature. And so on every level, seeing self in system instead of just self as separate from, I think is the essence of what I would like people to take away, and how we can use organizational context to create this new sense making and help grow this understanding of the world.
Yeah. Joan, we've been talking about your purpose in the world, about how you help leaders transition from the, let me put it in a way of the linear to the systemic, and what it's like to transition from a collapse of the personal and role to a little bit more space in between that allows for reflection and new choices on how to contribute to the systems that we're part of. We talked about myths around corporate culture, and that it's very important that we look at our underlying assumptions and patterns and mental constructs and models that we created of the context that we live and work in, and especially that we lead in. And we talked about your methodology, about Orgonomics, and how you work with leaders, and you shared with us various examples of how you invite them to step into the systemic more. And you also shared with us that this is not just a mental exercise for you, that this is something that that also came from a while back when you were giving a magical gift, as you mention it, that you really want to share with the world, and that you grasped it because it served you in your personal family system, and also many more times over in your work. I would like to say thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and experience, and for having this conversation with me in the context of the summit. Thank you so much for being on.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Jennifer. Thank you.
And to everyone who's been watching, I hope that this conversation rattled your cage a little bit, and that it's an invitation to look at your own mental models about the roles that you fulfill in the many systems that you are undoubtedly part of. If you want to share your knowledge and experience or insights, then please continue the conversation on our online community space. Thank you so much for watching. Take care. Bye-bye.